Animal Farm, a fairy story by George Orwell, with an introduction by Theo Orbit, and afterward by Russell Baker. Introduction. It's been 75 years since the comrades of the once and future Manor Farm first took up the anthem Beasts of England, and surprised themselves by routing out the tyrant farmer, Mr. Jones, from his holdings. 75 years since the seemingly inalterable tenets of animalism were scrawled in white paint on the inside of the barn, an enthusiastic dreamer Snowball strove for his short-lived utopia before running afoul of the Berkshire Boar Napoleon's autocratic ambitions. In the decades since the publication of George Orwell's seminal work of anti-Stalinist satire, we had seen the collapse of the regime that disturbed and inspired its author, the beginning and end of the Cold War, the fall of its attendant horrors, and the rise and fall of any number of would-be Napoleons, both at home and abroad. Animal Farm, once a work so controversial that it seemed unlikely to find a publisher, had searched for so long and in so many school curriculums. As a predominant introduction to the concept of totalitarianism, and that it is in danger of being perceived as trite. If Animal Farm George Orwell, then a 42-year-old democratic socialist, known primarily for essays and journalism exploring social injustice and class inequities across Europe, hoped only to dissuade his countrymen from what he recognized as a dangerous infatuation with Stalin. It is indisputable that an author's intention for his or her work usually don't survive publication, let alone the author's death. None of Animal Farm's success during Orwell's lifetime could really augur the very purposes it would come to serve, or the global behemoth it would quickly become. Pushing back on a critique that Orwell is too light-handed in his reproach of totalitarianism, Julian Simmons wrote, "In 100 years' time, perhaps Animal Farm may be simply a fairy story. Today is a political satire with a good deal of a point. That was then, and this is now. Luckily, having spent the last 7.5 decades heeding his warnings and taking his lessons to heart, we have pulled ahead of the dangers of Animal Farm and we might face one day. As a species, we have defied Orwell's wildest expectations. Wouldn't he be thrilled to know that we no longer have need of a text that so explicitly decrees authoritarianism, fear-mongering, tribalism, historical erasure, factual manipulation, and a war as an engine of national pride? That Animal Farm has served its purpose and is now nothing but a fairy story, as Julian Simmons hoped? Reader, I jest. All evidence points to the fact that we're in a great deal of very familiar trouble the whole world over. We are so dependably meant to be, despite the existence of prophetic works like Animal Farm, should worry us to the point of despair. But this is the way of our species. Memory fades. We grow bored with the lessons of the past. We don't even have to work especially hard to blur the myths we tell ourselves. That the past is only the past. That the past is not only the past, but already ancient history. Things could never get as bad as they once were, because, unlike those who came before us, we are good people. We know better than let it happen again. How then? Are we to read Animal Farm circa 2020? What can we demand of a book that has outlived its own ambitions, yet whose pillars presently seem as relevant today as as they were 3/4 of a century ago? I was raised in the former Yugoslavia in the mid-1980s, in a household and culture gripped by the distinction between indoor and outdoor talk. Understanding this was essential to my early upbringing, as table manners or the correct protocol for crossing the street. The gist was certain conversations were appropriate for public consumption, while others belonged only within the confines of the house. You're expected to use your common sense to distinguish between the two as you grew older, but your starting point was to assume that anything ordered at a dinner table qualified as indoor talk and was not to be discussed with people outside the home, that is, outdoors. You think I'm talking about politics here, reader? No, I'm not. Politics was so out of bounds that I can't remember any adult ever declaring support for any candidate at president until we moved to America. I'm talking about I'm talking about simple details of daily existence. New pencil case that might be misconstrued as a sign of increased wealth, or sandwich that might give a nosy stranger on a train some false idea about the demographic composition of our family because one of its ingredients may or may not be a certain kind of ham. People incapable of recognizing the distinction between indoor and outdoor talk. People who might volunteer ulteriorly, eagerly, the outcome of some private development, or some holiday plan, or worst of all, sins. The affairs of some mutual acquaintance were to be regarded with disdain and suspicion, or if they didn't value the sanctity of their own indoor talk, imagine the damage they could inflict if they somehow got hold of yours. The logic of this was unimpeachable. A person who did not know your business could not be coerced into revealing it to some sinister inquisitor. I can hear you laughing, reader. It is quaint Balkan paranoia, but it wasn't a laughing matter. It still isn't. I've been living in America for 23 years, and still have a hair of trigger where indoor talk is concerned. To this day, if new acquaintances volunteer information about their spouse, job, finances, health, or personal history on a schedule I perceive to be too fast moving for a relationship, I start to view them as liabilities. This reflex will be with me forever, I suspect. I probably hardwired in some remote twist of trauma, but it's DNA inherent, and people worn down by centuries of imperialism and political validity or volatility. I think validity. Even though, even those of us who exalted Joseph Broz to those defiance of solid rejection of Soviet values, not live under the private delusion that government, regardless of who sat in power, was a benevolent force. We feared surveillance, police, and a covetous gaze of our big-mouthed neighbors. We weren't cowards. Of course, injustice against others was always a good cause for uproar. Injustices against oneself were to be borne with gritted teeth, lest the price of speaking up be levied against one's nearest and dearest. That one might, whether or whatever calamity had most recently insinuated itself upon her. Leave notions just like justice and equality to the naive Americans and Western Europeans. History had taught us better than to believe in fairy stories. Perhaps that's why I did eventually read Animal Farm. Sometime in 1997, no doubt in a suburb of Atlanta, my mother and I eventually wound up after spending most of the Yugoslav wars in Cyprus and Egypt. The character with whom I felt the most kinship was Benjamin the donkey. Sorry, the word mare Clover had the word mare Clover had a kind of aspirational maternity. There was something professionally single-minded about Molly, the little horse who throws in with the enemy in exchange for sugar and ribbons. I was heartbroken by the heavily foreshadowed death of Boxer the horse, who seemed to stand for so much of what was good and true. All I really cared about was whether his little donkey friend would successfully dodge a similar fate. Benjamin is Boxer's closest companion, a cynic of uncertain age. He is known for having outlived all of his peers by keeping steadfastly silent. Animal Farm scholars have often cast him as allegorical stand-in for Russia's disillusioned older generation. As wary of the revolutions as they were of the Tsarist society it dismantled. And indeed, in his keep it close to the vest reticence, I think, I recognize many of my grandparents' tendencies. In possession of common sense, but a potent distrust of propaganda, a tendency to keep eye roll at naivety, above all, a really keen sense of the difference between indoor and outdoor talk. Benjamin is a survivor, numb to surprise and disappointment alike. He allows that silence to weather the darkest days of Napoleon's reign. Even as he weathered the darkest day of Mr. Jones, donkeys live a long time. He often reminds us, and none of you has ever seen a dead donkey. Benjamin's preoccupation of staving off his own morality is understandable. After all, what rules us more firmly than the urge to survive? And if his reluctance to saw the obvious signs of ruin for his more gullible barnyard compatriots seems a little selfish, at least they can be sure he would be similarly disinclined to share their indoor talk with pigs or dogs, or anyone who would weaponize it against them. This precarious web of silence comes crashing down, and his dear friend Boxer is carted off to Wilmington after succumbing to labor and age. Though Squealer persuades the other animals that Boxer is, of course, bound only for the animal hospital to receive care, Benjamin finally breaks with precedent to tell them the terrible truth he has always been literate enough to know. The van taking Boxer away bears the insignia of the dreaded knacker, and Boxer is going to his doom. His tired old body sold off to sell to pigs, having secretly revised one of the founding tenets of animalism, can get their trotters on some more booze. Perhaps because I completed Orwell's novella of his marginally more hopeful 1954 cartoon adaptation, or because my young mind threw up some wall to forget the sheer horror of all this. I spent many years falsely remembering that Boxer's fate marks a turning point for the animals, pulls back the curtain on their porcine overlords. But not so, it turns out. With the death of what is arguably the book's most beloved character, Orwell shows us the futility of Benjamin's revelation. It is too late for fraternal duty to override self-preservation. The old donkey has kept vital knowledge to himself for far too long, and the tide of manipulation can no longer be turned. Squealer scolds the animals for spreading the unfounded rumor that Boxer has gone to the knackers. Once they accepted the low porker's explanation, Benjamin, like Old Man River, goes back to knowing something about saying nothing. Rereading Animal Farm earlier this month, I found myself searching for evidence of the indoor talk that emerged, spurring the animals to action after Boxer's death. It is certainly implied to have taken place, thus life on the farm is no longer the same. Things get grim, and quickly the weight of hopelessness is obsolete. My false memory, most of the animals grow to share Benjamin's awareness of their predicament. But what I found in the pages of Orwell's novella was a barnyard full of lift subscribers to Squealer's propaganda, or workers too exhausted by regime's demands to find the energy to contemplate resistance. I then found myself asking, is it possible that Orwell really thought his characters were so utterly unaware of what was happening to them? The answer, I think, lies in the basic craft question that always seems to raise its head between the second and third draft of any piece of writing. For whom was this written? In his essay, Right, Orwell attributes his anti-authoritarian political and literary persuasions in part to what he learned about empire, by sharing with the Indian Peel police in Burma. He was no stranger to mortal terror. Still, his intended audience for Animal Farm is not the Russian proletariat, but a Western intelligentsia, generously enamored of the Stalin. One could not have a better example of the moral and emotional shallowness over time, he wrote in 1941, than the fact that we are now all more or less pro-Stalin. The disgusting murderer is temporarily on our side, and so the purges, etc., are suddenly forgotten. Because Orwell's priority is to efficiently demonstrate how autocrats seize power, he fastens animal form's narrative arc to events rather than emotions, to chronology rather than empathy. It shows us a sequence of plot points whereby a revolution succeeds, makes a genuine attempt at social betterment, and is eventually corrupted. With the exception of a single scene of slaughter, he dwells neither on his forgotten Stalinist purges or the steady violence and brutality. Validity? Virtual validity. That brings the population to heel. In 1946, perhaps such detailing was unnecessary. His intended audience, after all, was of his own time, aware of the discourse dominating its own historical moment. Perhaps they didn't need to see the growing fear, the exhaustion, the relentless calculations, the survival that wear a society down to complacency and its own oppression, all that laid out right there on the page. Perhaps it was enough to write that the animals are uneasy when they see their comrades fatally confessing to allegiance with a banished snowball, uneasy with their memories of the Battle of the Cowshed are called into question. But 75 years later, Orwell's shortcut gives future audience room enough to distance himself from the original messages of his work. No society is inherently safe from these horrors. The notion that Western countries are clever and strong enough to both recognize and resist the grip of totalitarianism is a dangerous myth, a fairy story, if you will, one to which we are ironically susceptible. Because being shaped by animal farm deludes us into thinking we're sufficiently armed. We already know that we need to know, you might say. We all know that individuality is a form of resistance, and that anyone who hungrily pursues power is probably unworthy of attaining it. And as we are surely beyond Orwell's starting premise, that many other forms of animals are naturally susceptible to manipulation and the cult of personality, we might let ourselves believe that his message no longer applies to us. But the moral and emotional shallowness Orwell decided in his time was not dissipated, and of all the things Animal Farm has taught us, as a matter of course, perhaps the most important to reflect on in this new, baffling century is how the animals outdoor talk, openly encouraged in a debating society, Orwell, when sought to build, turns fight to indoor talk before it become now no talk at all. Here's some formerly indoor talk. We must take our feelings for granted. Even now, those of us that never grew up fearing the dangers of indoor talk are far too cozy in the belief that we are safe from the forces that could plunge us back into a world that demands it. Animal Farm acts to work against the delusion all the time. The survivors of Stalinist Russia may have used times to endure, as Benjamin did. Times have changed, and the only way forward is to ensure that all talk is had outdoors. We are making great strides in this direction already. Also, the meaningful cultural changes that have shaped our society in the early decades of this new century are owed to our increasing willingness to blur the line between outdoor and indoor talk. And opening up about the persistent daily injustices that shape life, micro and macroaggressions, racial profiling, police brutality, exploitation of body and mind, intolerance, erasure, assault, exclusion, and even the most disenfranchised among us have found themselves wielding, if even for a moment, sudden and unprecedented power to enact change that once took a lifetime. Despite its many flaws, the internet, whose worst effects on our species remain to be seen, and will probably necessitate many more essays on how to read not only Animal Farm, but 1984 as well, but has ushered in a generation increasingly baffled by the concept of indoor talk, a generation constitutionally opposed to certain kinds of silence, or draw back to that, of course. Our species is becoming distracted, unimaginative, narcissistic. Our attention spans are short, and the change brought by our outrage is sometimes arbitrary. Anonymity seems to compel incredible cruelty in some of us. The worst among us, nostalgic for horrors of yesteryear, and maddened by the loss of power, and relevance, are called into horrific kinship. But at our best, we're able to stand with and for one another like never before. We celebrate one another's rights to individuality, expression, faith, and love. And we might yet prove that surveillance is an increasingly futile weapon against a society that so freely, impulsively, and often foolishly self-reports every detail of its existence to the point of madness, yes, but also in a great and constant course that shows occasional glimmers of true camaraderie, true forces in numbers, and that, I think, might be worth all the bad, at least for now. Perhaps this, too, is a fairy story, and, like most, will let us down in ways we can't yet imagine. But the least we can hope is that at least in its wake of society, incapable of both silences, we have a quarter century to test Julian Simmons' hopeful prediction and usher Animal Farm into this niche of fairy stories. I'm not sure even that is time enough. It's entirely possible that we narrowly live in a world free of Napoleons and the squealers who prop them up, that we will always be at the mercy of dogs raised in proximity to power and hand reared on the red meat of ignorance, that we will always find ourselves peering through windows, unable to tell the difference between people claiming to be serving our interests and enemies to whom they have betrayed us. But it's also possible that we will never be isolated enough to keep signs of danger to ourselves as we once did. That we will openly decree every exchange to our commandments and insist on reiterating the history we know to be true, however terrible its contents. It is possible that we will recognize, without the blinders of squealers' proper perspective, that danger to one is danger to all. That we will read the knacker's signature aloud for all to hear before it's too late. Tear or Brit is the end of the introduction.